guys, welcome back to another episode of Chats in the Blog Cabin. You know, the show where I invite people virtually into the blog cabin to chat about life. You know who I am. I'm Melissa. I'm here all the time. And today we're going to be chatting about grief and the grief process and how everybody deals with grieving differently. But we're talking about not only people that grieve loss of other people and other circumstances, but also grieving about your pets as well. And so today, Kevin Ringstaff is joining us. And Kevin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for having me on. You know, I have to say, too, that I'm a huge fan of your intro. I don't know if anyone's ever told you that, but I was sitting there in rapt attention. You know, again, thank you for having me on. I'm Kevin Ringstaff from Grieving at Work and petcloud.pet. Grieving at Work, we teach management how to talk about and support other people who are going through grief. And with Pet Cloud, it's all about just building a community around people who have lost pets and just need that space to just express their grief and be together.
And so how did you get into building a profession around grief? Because a lot of people, that's a really heavy subject, and a lot of people don't want to deal with that. So what made you decide to do that?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people don't want to deal with it, like myself included. For the first, 3 decades of my life, I was in computer science, and I was raised in a place where we didn't really talk about grief growing up. And, when that happens, you just push it down. You hold on to your grief. And when I eventually had, some, losses of my own and, job losses, relationships, pets, all of that, it just builds up and you hold on to it. And eventually it's going to come out in other areas of your life. And that's what happened to me. And when that happened, I looked out for support, and I started off with the Association of Pet Loss and Bereavement. And, I got certified through them, and then I went and found out about becoming a pet chaplain. And then I went through the Grief Recovery Institute. They have a lot of good programs and people around grief there. And finally, now I'm studying to be a board certified hospital chaplain.
Wow. So a pet chaplain, that's not something that a lot of people, actually hear about. So tell us what pet chaplains do.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, we don't, you're right. We don't hear a lot about it because, it's not something that we really think about when we lose a pet. But it's the exact same as a regular chaplain. Like, we talk a little bit about faith and what happens when our pets die. We do things like hold memorial ceremonies and funeral services. And we just bring other people together. When we have a pet, like I said earlier, we don't think about, bringing all of our friends and family together, everyone who knew them, to talk and share stories. And that's one of the hallmark things that funerals bring comfort to us by doing.
That is so true. So how many pet chaplains are there in the United States?
Maybe a dozen or two. Not a whole lot.
Wow. And where are they mostly located at? Because I know you're on the West Coast. Or it's mostly a West Coast thing, or is it mostly all over the place? Or
I would say probably an East Coast thing. The gentleman who founded it, Rob Gurka, petchaplain.org, he's based out of North Carolina. He does regular chaplaincy work, and then he's kind of started this whole movement about a decade ago.
He's based out of where I'm at right now. I'm in North Carolina, so wow, I did not even know that. So let's talk about how we can help people when they're grieving their pets, because that's very important, to go through that grieving process and not try to just push the memories down.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that so many people try to do initially in grief. Right, especially if we don't have that support. By support, I mean someone in your life, like a friend or a family member that you trust enough to go talk with about pet loss. One of the problems with losing a pet is it's not validated. People say some terrible things around it. They try to compare it to other grief and push it away, diminish it, minimize it. And we have to be a little bit careful about who we share our grief with. It has to be someone that we know, like, and trust who can hold that grief for us.
Especially if the people that you're sharing the grief with are not dog, cat, lizards, whatever has passed away, that type of person. like snakes and things like that. Somebody may not understand why you're crying over your snake dying because, so I remember when our dogs died, our first really dog that we had as a family, she was an abandoned dog and she ended up having puppies later on. And we kept one of her dogs. And that one just died just a couple of years ago. And we were all just like so grief stricken because, they're part of your lives. They become such a huge part of your everyday life. And so we decided that we were going to take a rose bush and we got a different color because of their personalities. And we planted a rose garden. So we have 3 rose bushes right now. And I am not looking forward to the day when our 10-year-old Shih Tzu passes because she is like my baby. She is like, as you see in the intro, she's in the intro. She's all over everything that I do. So it's so hard. So how can we process that? Because there are some people that immediately want to go out and grab another pet and say, okay, well, I'm replacing this one immediately. Think what can people do to help themselves through the grieving process?
You touched on something too. I'll highlight just for a moment that people want to go out and replace that loss. Well, we can't do that. They're getting another pet's not going to replace them. It's that unique relationship that we've lost. My dog right now, Sir William Broderick, he's right down here. You can't see him. Big old English sheepdog. He's 13 and a half years old now. He's nearing the end of his life. And I look back at all the time that we've spent together, all those moments, all those memories, everything that he supported me through, all those good times in my life and bad times. And, I can't replace that with another relationship, another dog, at any time in my life. It's unique and we can't replace it. And so when we're thinking about that, it's a very unique thing for you, the person listening to this. If you feel that you're ready to start a brand new relationship with a new pet, a new dog or a cat or what have you, then go ahead and do it. And if you feel like you're still holding on to the grief, you're still going through it, then just wait. You're not accountable to anyone else but yourself in this.
So what do you say? How do you help your pet deal with the grief? Because when you have pets that are like all the time together and they've been together for like years and years and years, and then one passes away, how do you help that pet get through, the one that's still alive, get through?
Yeah, that's hard too. The definition of grief is a loss of a familiar pattern or change in behaviors. And when my cat Ponce Leon, you might have seen him walking around earlier, as he's often wont to do. But I lost his brother Blazer about 2 years ago now, and they had never spent more than a moment apart. When that happens, when you have pets who are so closely bonded and you lose one of them, right? It's that behavior that is still that pattern. It's still, our pets can grieve that just like we do. And we support them just by giving them extra love and attention. Because there's not a whole lot else that we can do, really.
That is so true. And so what would you say to someone who is trying to support a friend who has lost a dear pet, or as I call them, my fur babies, because they're not pets. They're part of the family. So what would you say to help if you were a friend of someone who's lost a pet?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would, suggest to do is that there's nothing that we can say that's going to make it better. Right? This is grief in general. There's nothing that we can say or do that's going to make that grieving experience any better. We can't take the pain away. We can just be present for it and say, I'm sorry. And that's really what we do. And we do that for weeks because grief takes time.
And there's so many people that discount people that are grieving over losing their pets because they don't understand. How can we make people understand that this is important to, maybe not to them, but to the other people, and to kind of be gentle with other people's feelings?
A lot of that's just teaching people how to be more compassionate, more just more in touch with like emotion, like they call it emotional equivalence now, IQ and EQ scores. And I actually have a whole course on this too, where I'm teaching management how to do this exact thing. There's not a lot to learning how to be there for someone, right? There's a lot to grief, a lot to like helping someone go through it. But for a friend or a family member, someone who's not a professional doing it, it's presence, right? And just being okay with the silence and the awkwardness. Because when we're seeing someone that we know and love who is grieving, it reminds us that, oh, I've also had grief. I am also going to die at some point, and it's uncomfortable to sit with. And that's why, as a society, especially in America, we just avoid it.
Yep, we totally avoid it. We don't want to talk about it. Sometimes we act like people are still alive because we just want to avoid it. Our pets are still alive. So what do you say to that? The people that are just ignoring that?
Well, there's not a whole lot you can say, right? It's just, I would say, tell them that, as a friend, you're there to listen. We have communities that, have other people who are going through the same loss. Like, for instance, Pet Cloud, we have free Sunday groups that meet every single Sunday for anyone who's going through this kind of loss. It's just sharing this and being around this. It's petcloud.pet. And it just being around that community, around other people who feel that same thing, it helps. It really does.
So let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about 2020 and the grief that people feel over basically a lost year, because I know there's a lot of people in the society right now that are grieving over the loss of money, the loss of home, loss of family members and friends who actually lost their lives to COVID. I mean, loss of the change of the world, how we know it, because that was a huge change last year. So let's talk about how to deal with that.
I like how you said that, the grief over a lost year. We lost an entire year of society. And like, not only that, and like you said, we've lost, what is it now? 600,000 people in America from COVID. They say that for every one person who dies, they leave 9 people who grieve that loss on average. So that's, 4.5 million people just from COVID, just in America. And that's just death. We're not talking about all the other regular death that happens, like heart disease, cancer. People die regularly every single day. And they're dying alone at the bedside too during that year because family members couldn't be with them. And the surviving family members are only dealing with that loss, but they're dealing with the fact that they couldn't be there. And that's a huge loss that's never going to be filled. We've lost, loss of health, loss of jobs, loss of financial security, loss of trust in our government. Right? Loss of faith in our societies. We've had, race wars and Black Lives Matter and people just going, all of this, it's all loss. It's all grief. And right now, this is a unique point in history because every single person is grieving. We're all grieving some sort of loss. And this is the best time we're ever going to have in our lives to talk about this. Like as nationally, and just change some of these policies and change some of this awkwardness and uncomfortableness we feel about them.
Yeah, that is so true. I mean, because I don't think people, when COVID first started, people actually believed it was actually happening. They thought it was the government conspiracy theory. But then when it came out, it was like all the hate toward the Asian community came out too. And I know the Corona beer sales, I'm just going to bring this up, went down because people were associating Corona with the coronavirus. And I'm like, how do you get past the grieving the loss of intelligence as well? Because some people were not even thinking right.
That's funny. Grieving the loss of intelligence. Like, I don't think it's intelligence, right? Like we feel how we feel, and how we think determines how we feel. And if how we think is based on everyone around us, and if everyone around us is saying things like coronavirus is fake, then we're most likely to believe that. I'm from Tennessee originally, and I lost my grandmother this past year, like a few months ago actually, and I remember that she died thinking that, wondering what she was talking about, how like she couldn't believe that they did all that stuff to Mr. Trump and kicked him out of office and all of that, because where she was, that's the only thing she was hearing. Right. And like, so it's not intelligence at all. It's just who we are, who we're around, and what our society and what our media, social media and radios and news outlets are saying to us.
So let's talk about that, the influence of social media on grief. Because that is huge. Before, you would grieve kind of in private, and then the internet happened, and then social media, and now it's like immediately, almost to the point that people are posting on social media before they're actually telling their friends and family about a loss.
There's a lot to social media and grief, and I'm not really a social media expert. And this is my personal opinion, but I think social media is just very impersonal. Right? It's easier to be impersonal online. It's easier to say that I've had a loss online than it is to tell someone in person. Because maybe if I say it online, maybe I don't have to deal with it anymore. Maybe I don't have to say it 40, 50 times to 40 different people.
Well, I've never even thought about that. So let's talk about how people can deal with having to tell the story over and over and over again, because that's, that's the last thing you, when you're grieving, want to have to explain what happened, and then all of a sudden you have to explain it. So how can they deal with that?
I have a whole lesson on my Grieving at Work course about this, about how this is teaching a manager how to like bring their a grieving employee back into the workplace after bereavement leave, after a traumatic loss, right? And one of them, I just lost what I was going to say. What was that question again?
It's like, how can you tell someone who is going through this and they have to explain like 40 or 50 times about something that's happened, especially if it's not a publicized loss.
Yeah.
How they have to tell people, and then they're grieving all over again each time they tell the story.
Yeah. One of the things I recommended to do was to send out, or when you're an employee, you're ideally talking to one person. And I go over this in my course, but you're talking to one person, your point of contact in the company, right? So you don't want to be talking to 50 different people in your company, or your 8 different managers. You just want one person. And that one person can share that with everyone, including things like, here's the funeral. If you want to send a gift, here's where to send it. And also, thank you for all your love and concern, but please don't bring this up to me at work, as and we could say things like that we really need to, that's going to help us too.
Yeah, but there's always that one or two people that, I don't want to say nosy, but some of them are kind of nosy, that they want to know all the circumstances around it. How do you tactfully deal with people like that when you're in the grieving process?
If I'm grieving and I don't want to talk about it, I'll just say, hey, thank you, but I can't talk about this right now. Yeah, remember, you're not accountable to anyone else, right? They're curious, right? That's on them, right? But if we don't have the energy, I talk a lot about energy, the energy of grief. Grief takes a tremendous amount of energy, mental, physical energy to grieve. And if we don't have it to give to someone else, it's okay to say no to that. It's empowering to say no to that.
It's almost like you can get back a little piece of control of what you're feeling, and you can control your feelings a little bit by saying no. Wow. I mean, how long? Because a lot of people, like my sister died 26 years ago, and I still grieve. Sometimes it'll hit me. So how long is the grieving process?
I have a fun graphic that's, there is no finish line in grief. There's no magic line that you're going to run over and suddenly everything's fine. Right? We've lost a piece of ourselves in some cases, and in some ways that's never going to be okay. Mm-hmm. It's not always going to be painful. Right? The pain specifically is something we say goodbye to, but it's always going to be sad. Right? When we have trauma, it's always going to be traumatic when we think about it. It's always going to be sad, but it's not going to be painful, and that very specifically we say goodbye to.
Now, I know there's different types of grief, but what do you say to people that, like, someone dies like immediately and you don't even go through, you don't even know, and all of a sudden one morning you wake up and they're gone? And then there's other people that have, like cancer or things like that, or Alzheimer's, and you've seen them slowly decline, and it seems like the grieving process seems to last longer maybe with those, because they start grieving from the time that the person was diagnosed up until the time they die.
Yeah those are two very different losses.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk about the sudden one first. The shock, the trauma, and that it might be a shorter experience, but the grieving experience might be longer. It might be more traumatic because we don't have that time to say goodbye. We don't have the time to say, I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I forgive you, and goodbye.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that, that anticipatory bereavement is what I call it. Knowing someone's getting older, that you're going to have to say goodbye. That's a hard process in of itself. That's its own grief too. That's different. To watch someone slowly die that you love. And, with that, we're just being present as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And this is something that so many caregivers don't do, is we have to take care of ourselves throughout that process, right? Self-care is not selfish. We have to fight for it. We have to do it. Because, if, like, for instance, if I'm not taking care of myself, I can't take care of anyone else.
Yep. That is so true. And do you think that's a lot? You mentioned compassion fatigue in your little bio that you sent me, but I actually was interviewing a lady the other day that wrote a book. It's called Happy Vet, Happy Pet. And it talks about the incidence of suicide in veterinarians because of how they had to deal with the grieving process. So let's talk about compassion fatigue.
I'm glad you brought that up. With this past year, this has been really hard for healthcare workers, essential workers, but our veterinarians are also essential workers. And, they have, compassion fatigue and burnout, and they have one of the highest suicide rates in professionals out there. And there's a lot to that. I get a lot of my clients calling in saying that, they wish their vet had done this or seen that sooner, or, and there's a lot of anger that's around grief too, because, with our pets, things happen suddenly, mm-hmm. right? We don't, they're just fine. And then just downhill dead. It's a lot of the time. And that's the advent of medicine. And that's generally a good thing, but it's shocking. And we tend to blame. And we tend to go on social media and blame and harass. And there's a lot that veterinarians, there's a lot of abuse that they get that's, unwarranted, really. But it derives from grief. So it's coming from a very hurt place. Mm-hmm. So it's all a little bit about, just, educating and being more compassionate. But I talk about compassion fatigue, and, it all goes back to self-care. Mm-hmm. If you're a veterinarian and you're listening to this, it goes back to your self-care. What things do you do every day to find pleasure? Do you find gratitude in what you do still? Nobody wants to be a vet to harm animals. That just that just doesn't happen. No. Right? There's plenty of other careers for that. So you go into veterinarians because you care about animals. You want to do good. And that predominantly that's what happens.
Yeah, but the lady that was interviewing the other day was talking about how, with humans, like if there is extreme measures, that they tend to take the extreme measures to have the human to last longer. But if there's a chance between an expensive procedure for your pet or putting your pet down, a lot of people tend to choose putting their pet down because of the fact that they don't see I don't want to say the value, but they see all they see is dollar signs. And so the vets are really feeling that because they see a pet they can help, but because the person can't afford that particular protocol of medicines or whatever, they choose to put their pets down. And that's, I think, a lot of times what vets deal with as well.
Yeah, that's hard too. And when we're thinking about the end of life for our pets, because we have that choice, because we can put them to sleep and take away the pain, that's a different situation, right? Our pets, putting a 16-year-old dog through chemotherapy is, it might be medically viable and it might help, but that 16-year-old dog is not going to know what's going on, why they're feeling sick for months and months. These last minute surgeries, they might help, but they might not improve the quality of life. Because if your pet can't walk around, it's not like they can just, Netflix and chill and wait to get better. Like they don't have that concept of death. They don't have the concept of I'll feel better in the future. They just know I'm feeling terrible now.
Yeah, that is so true. Now, when we come back, we got to take a brief commercial break. But when we come back, I want to talk about grief in the workplace and what the cost of it is and how employers and employees can help each other in the workplace with the grief. So we'll be right back after a commercial.
Hi, I'm Stratton Leopold from Leopold's Ice Cream in Savannah, Georgia. 11 years ago, we started the I Pledge Project, giving children who can recite the Pledge of Allegiance from memory a free scoop of ice cream. So join us. Over 200 shops across the country have over the last 11 years. Join us in July, National Ice Cream Month, and Independence Day for iPledgeForIceCream.com.
And we are back. Now, so let's talk about grief in the workplace. First of all, how long should people stay out of work when they're grieving process?
That's a loaded question. Sorry, Fonzie. In the U.S., we typically have 3 to 5 days of bereavement leave. That's the 3 to 5 days is something that we give to have people, let them off work for the most traumatic portion of it. The crying on the floor kinds of part of it, the planning the funeral, that kind of stuff. But as we know, that doesn't go away after the 3 or 5 days. I mean, it's Monday morning, a week from now, they're going to be right back in the office, and all of that's still there. I talk a lot about the cost of grief and how just giving people the time and space they need to heal is going to ultimately save money. It's that ultimately retain that employee. They'll be better mentally, physically, and they'll just be more committed and engaged in the job when we give them time and space to heal. So when they come back to the office on Monday, they're not going to be okay. And we can be prepared and have that be okay too. Maybe have a lighter work schedule for them for the next a week or two. Maybe like allow what I call for grief breaks. 15 minutes, like when grief strikes, and like anyone who's grieved and like really grieved knows that it just comes out of warning sometimes, out of left field. And a lot of times when that happens, people go home for the day instead of just taking 15 minutes and just managing their grief, maybe taking a walk around the building, chilling out in the break room, what have you, and then going back to work. And then you don't lose the whole day. You just lose, a little bit. And a lot of things I recommend are these little things that we can do to help out.
Because I know a lot of people, the grief really doesn't, sure, it sets in right when right when the person dies, but a lot of it really sets in after they go through the motions of planning the funeral, and the funeral takes place and everybody else leaves and they're left alone. That's when a lot of times when the grief really sets in on people.
Mm-hmm.
So how can they help manage that?
Yeah. You know, when we have that death, like you were talking about, it's just a whirlwind, a blur of activity until they're in the ground and we're back at work. No real time to really process what that ongoing emptiness is going to be like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some of the hardest times for people in grief are, you know, at the end of the day. You know, like when we're going home for the day, for instance, right close to 5. You know, like when we're at work, we can be distracted. We're busy. We're mentally focused and engaged at work.
Mm-hmm.
But towards the end of the day, we know we're going home to that empty house, to that loss, facing that loss day after day. That is where the work of grief actually happens. And, you know, that's where we can do the most help too. Because, you know, like we talked about earlier, there's no timeline in grief.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this can go on for weeks and months. And when, as an employee, you know, grief takes your productivity away. It might lower you from 100% down to 70% or 60%. You know, which is okay at the beginning, right? But if you're, like we said, grieving for weeks and months, that adds up to a lot of money real fast. And one of the things I like to recommend is to, you know, have a buddy at work that you can talk with about this. Have a support system at work. You know, these are things that, you know, employers can create over time, especially larger ones. You know, 1,000 or more employees. There are certainly people who have had similar losses in that big of an employee pool. And it's just.
So you just brought up this. Sorry, I interrupted. But so do you think it would benefit the companies to have someone on staff that is like a grief counselor to help with issues like this?
Well, there's a lot of companies that do. You know, it's not necessary to have a paid person on staff. You know, a lot of what we do, or we can do to help out in grief, is peer counseling. You know, your friends and your family just showing up over and over again, just being understanding, holding space. You know, that doesn't take any time or training, really. Just compassion and showing up consistently.
Mm. So let's talk about how much grief in the workplace costs businesses.
You know, I often quote this statistic. This is done by the Grief Recovery Institute back in 2002. 2002, so almost 20 years ago. They estimated it costs employers in the United States $100 billion a year in lost productivity due to grief and trauma. Wow. Now, I'm thinking now it's probably $250 billion a year. Last year was an anomaly, but I'm thinking 2019, right? $250 billion. Last year is something else.
Totally something else.
And what's really fun is that all this grief from this lost year, it's still with us. Mm-hmm. As society, you know, as we start to open up, which in San Francisco we opened up yesterday, right? As we start to open up, everyone's going to want to go and forget about it and move on and get back to normal. Mm-hmm. And just push all this under the rug, like we as society love to do with grief. And we can't let that happen, because all of this grief is still there, right? Pretending it doesn't exist is going to be a huge detriment for us.
So what can business leaders do to help support their employees that are grieving? You already talked about the 15-minute breaks and lighten the workload, but what else can they do to help?
Well, I have a whole course that just teaches you about grief, teaches management and HR and leaders about grief, what it is, what to say, what not to say to people in grief. You know, like, you know, they're in a better place, or time heals all wounds, or why don't you just go get another dog, or at least you can try again to have another baby. You know, these are terrible things that people say that may be very well-meaning people. But these are things that are told to us our whole lives. that our parents learned from their parents and so forth. And a lot of this is just education, and it's just learning about grief and normalizing it.
Yeah, because I don't think that's something that a lot of people talk about. They don't talk about when they're grieving. They don't talk about their feelings. They don't talk about their emotions. If they're depressed because they're in the grieving process.
Yeah.
Something that there's a stigma around it. If you're not a happy person all the time, and if you may need medicine to help you get through the grieving process, then something's definitely wrong with you. There's that stigma there.
Yeah. And it's not just a stigma with grief, it's a stigma with mental health in general, right? It's all of it, because we're only allowed to be happy, horny, angry in this society. And those are the three emotions that are okay. Anything other than that, depressed, like anything is just frowned upon. You heard that quote, laugh and the world laughs with you, cry and you cry alone. I always thought it's a little bit ludicrous to think of it that way, because imagine how ridiculous it would be if every time you laughed, you had to get up and walk out of a room because you didn't want to infect everyone else with how you're feeling.
Wow. That's a deep thought right there.
Yeah. Every single person is grieving right now. Every single person is. And just acknowledging that right there, it helps normalize grief and make it okay. Make grief to be okay. We all grieve. We can't run from it. 100% of us will experience grief at some point in our lives.
Wow. So our time is almost up. Do you have any one last little nugget to share with people about the grieving process or about grief in general?
Well, grief is universal. And there's a great book by Megan Devine, I think, that, she talks about it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to feel however we feel. And if we all let that be okay, that's one of the best things that we can do for one another.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people are thinking that they need to get over what happened last year. And it's going to take some time for everybody to get back to maybe not to where they were before, because I don't think the world's ever going to go back to being normal. But you got to think about what we gained instead of what we lost with last year.
Yeah, exactly.
So Kevin, tell us where people can find you.
I would love to. So my pet cloud, petcloud.pet, petcloud.pet. You just put .net up, but it's .pet. It's a fun top level domain. And, that's for our whole community around pet loss. Here we go. That's our whole community around pet loss. And we have support groups that meet almost every day of the week. And my other place you can find me is grievingatwork.com. And that's all about training management and HR, how to support grieving employees in the workplace. How do you teach them to be compassionate? Because that is something you can teach.
Yeah, you can. So once again, Kevin, I want to thank you for coming on Chats from the Blog Cabin and sharing about grief. This is a topic that a lot of people don't want to talk about. So thank you for holding that space for allowing people to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So guys, we will see you on the next Chat from the Blog Cabin.